towards zero segregation in education in Europe. I would like to, I hope everyone can hear me. I would like to thank the organizations who created this event today in joint partnership. CADO, the Center for Advocacy and Human Rights in Romania, Ergo Network, the Fundación Secretariado Gitano, the Amalipe Center for Interethnic Dialogue and Tolerance in Bulgaria, and last but not least, the Council of Europe. I would also like to thank the host, Mr. Romeo Franz, member of the European Parliament, who is among many other functions also the co-chair of the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup of the European Parliament, and whose office tireless work ensured that we can all be here in this year's Romani Week 2022. Segregation of Roma students in education is a widely known problem. With the event today, we have two objectives. We want to discuss the challenges in preventing and eliminating, as well as sanctioning segregation in education at a national level. Here we will have the chance to look at two country examples and see how Bulgaria and Spain are addressing the topic and how they promote effective inclusion. We can also be curious to see the results of CADO's monitoring report. But we are also going to examine the policy level. What are the concrete steps which we can take at a European level in order to effectively combat segregation in education and identify concrete steps to contribute and tackle anti-Gypsyism? We will look at examples of concrete cooperation between the EU and the national level, such as the In-School project. EU leaders from the beginning had a great interest in the event, and even though some of them cannot be here in person, they would like to pass on their messages through their offices or via video. First of all, Priscilla Mpanu, who will speak on behalf of Ms. Helena Dalli, European Commissioner for Equality. Commissioner Dalli is a strong promoter of the fight against racism and anti-Gypsyism and has provided a space for consultation and input to Roma organizations since she joined the European Commission. Thank you, Priscilla, for bringing us her message. I should also add that CADO will share the conclusions of this event with the Commissioner. Priscilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. Dear honourable members of the European Parliament and dear distinguished guests and participants, I'm very pleased to open the event on behalf of European Commissioner for Equality, Ms. Helena Dalli, who unfortunately could not join us today in person. Today we will be discussing how we can successfully move towards zero segregation in education in Europe. Segregation of Roma pupils continues to be a major challenge that we must address to achieve true equality and inclusion in Europe. Close to half of Roma children in Europe are still attending segregated schools or classes, and in some countries this concerns nearly 2 out of 3 Roma pupils. According to the data collected by the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, the level of segregation has also worsened over the last 5 years. In the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, we stress the need to provide equal access to education for all children from all ethnic and racial backgrounds. Schools should be a safe haven and should be free from racism and discrimination. They should be places where children can grow to achieve their full potential in a spirit of inclusion, mutual respect, and the acknowledgement of diversity. In stark contrast with these principles, segregated education is notorious for its substandard quality and for producing generation doomed to live an unfulfilled life. Segregation is the ultimate expression of exclusion and rejection, and we must act to put an end to it. As a first contribution to implementing the Anti-Racism Action Plan, we have also adopted the EU Roma Strategic Framework, setting out an ambitious 3-pillar approach to foster equality, to promote social inclusion, and to enable active participation. One of the main objectives of the framework is to increase effective access to quality, inclusive mainstream education. We have linked this objective to the headline target of cutting school segregation by at least half, which reflects the minimum progress expected by 2030. And of course, our long-term goal remains to eliminate school segregation totally all over Europe. And to achieve this goal, we need to work shoulder to shoulder with member states who have the main responsibility for organizing their educational systems. And it is therefore very encouraging that they have all demonstrated their commitment to addressing these challenges by unanimously adopting the Council recommendation on Roma equality, inclusion and participation. The Council recommendations give guidance to member states on how to better protect and include Roma children through concrete measures in their national Roma strategic frameworks. These measures include preventing and eliminating educational segregation, repairing past injustices in the field of education, and promoting equity, inclusiveness, and diversity in education systems. We are currently assessing these national frameworks, and we will publish an assessment report this autumn to take stock of the commitments made and to provide guidance and any necessary improvements. And at the European level, we will continue to support activities to strengthen positive narratives and role models, to fight negative stereotypes, to raise awareness about Roma history and culture, and to promote truth and reconciliation, especially under our Citizens' Equality, Rights and Values programme. I now look forward to this insightful and constructive discussion this afternoon, and I will relay all this information also to the Commissioner and our Cabinet, and I thank you very much for your attention. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Priscilla Mpanu for Commissioner Dalli. The next speaker will reach us through a video message. Commissioner Elisa Ferreira, who is the Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms. And she is tackling school segregation with the help of tools such as the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund. Her office is also in charge of monitoring and evaluating programs and measures for desegregation. So let us listen to Commissioner Ferreira's welcoming remarks.
Dear colleagues, our Europe is founded on solid values: solidarity, inclusion, equal rights for all. But segregation goes against those values. Segregation is unequal access, and segregation in education is perpetuating inequalities and discrimination. So I fully support this essential goal of zero segregation in European education, and I am delighted to associate myself to this event. We are currently negotiating the new cohesion programs, and we are asking member states to include clear commitments to non-discrimination and to desegregation in line with the objectives agreed in several documents, such as the European Union Roma Strategic Framework for Equality, Inclusion and Participation for the date 2020-2030, and the follow-on corresponding Council recommendations, as well as the European Union Anti-Racism Action Plan, which was devised for 2020-2025. Segregated settings strengthen the isolation of marginalized groups, contribute to unequal access to mainstream, inclusive and high-quality services, and sustain or even aggravate the disadvantaged position of marginalized groups. Through cohesion policy, we are supporting inclusion and desegregation. We did financed some operations. For instance, in Bulgaria, we supported the movement of 350 children from a local segregated school to mainstream schools. In Romania, we invested in the skills development of teachers and in after-school activities. In Spain, we financed 400 social houses to move families from segregated areas. And in the future, we will redouble our efforts. We are committed, but this is going to be a long journey. We cannot undo centuries of discrimination with the wave of a legislator's pen. It will require commitment and hard work on the ground over the coming years. We are encouraging member states to monitor progress with specific desegregation targets and indicators. And for all of this, we need you. We need your work and contacts on the ground. Our investments have a partnership requirement, which we will use to encourage programmers to work closely with stakeholders, such as national Roma contact points, bodies promoting fundamental rights and equality, NGOs, and community representatives. This will be a journey, but we are fully committed. With our investments and your work, your experience, your know-how, I believe we can make a difference. So I wish you a fruitful discussion and good work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ferreira. Now, last but not least, we will have Salima Yembu, who is a member of the European Parliament with the Renew Europe group and a member of the Committee on Culture and Education. In this function, she was the rapporteur of the recent report on the role of culture, education, media, and sport in the fight against racism. The report strongly condemns racial and ethnic segregation in all areas of life, but in particular in education, as a barrier to inclusion and as a hindrance for equal opportunities. Here are her welcoming words.
Europe Group, member of the Committee on Culture and of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe Group, member of the Committee on Culture and Education. I am honored to open the session of this year's Romani Week dedicated toward zero segregation in education in Europe. For those of you who know my work, you know that for me fighting against racism and discrimination in all of their forms is more than a box to tick. It's the basis of all my work, especially when it comes to education and youth policy. This was the case when I was a teacher and school director in the suburbs of Paris, and it's the case now that I am an MEP. We all agree that education is one of the best tools for tackling racism and discrimination and building inclusive societies. Children and young people need to learn about equality, respect, and tolerance at school, so that they can eradicate racism from the structures of our societies. This was the starting point of my report on the role of culture, education, media, and sports in the fight against racism, which has been approved by the European Parliament in March. But how can we expect the school to be a properly inclusive environment when we still see in Europe today many examples of racism in schools, including through school segregation? Eliminating school segregation was one of the points that I strongly fought to keep in the report. EU member states need to stop school segregation. Whether it's intentional, as is the case of the Roma, who are often sent to classes for children with special needs, or unintentional as a result of bad urban planning policies for which the children of a given community stay in the school of their neighborhood. Without interacting with other communities, and the mixed and richness is lost. When children arrive to school, that is their first contact with the society they will grow up in, and their first chance at building the life and future that they want and deserve. What do you think can happen if the first thing you tell a child is that they belong to a special school, that they are different, that they can only play and study with people who look like them? School segregation has proven time and time again to be discriminatory for children, not only when they start studying, but also once they are out of the school system and searching for a job. Often, schools where segregation exists offer lower quality education. This translates into lower skills and worse chance for young people to find a good job. Many studies have also proven that having a mixed environment at school not only fosters intercultural understanding and respect, but also increases results for the groups that are usually discriminated. Children starting from a disadvantaged background learn more and better when they study with their more advantaged peers. And the advantaged pupils don't lose either. Heterogeneity in the classroom is a win-win. With segregation, everyone loses. The segregated kids and the society as a whole, we will lose talents and will perpetuate racism. EU institutions and member states have a huge responsibility, therefore, to make sure that schools are inclusive and that they put an end to segregation in schools. Today's session will analyze the tools we have at our disposal, from ensuring quality education in all schools to putting in place a complete legal framework that prohibits discriminations. The Parliament gave its first contribution with my report on anti-racism. We need to ensure the follow-up now and go ever further with real legislation. I will have to stop to respect time limits, but I look forward to listening to the debate today. Thank you.
Thank you, MEP Salima Yambo, for this very, very true words. So thank you very much for all those messages. Now we will move to our first panel, Challenges in Preventing, Combating and Sanctioning Segregation in Education at National and EU Level, moderated by Isabella Mihalake, Senior Advocacy Officer at the European Roma Grassroots Organizations Network. Isabella?
Thank you very much, Damaris. Thank you for an excellent job. I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone, representatives from the European Union institutions, civil society organizations, Roma. Just a few housekeeping rules just before we start. I wanted to inform you that we have interpretation in Romanes in channel 25. We have our friend and colleague, Visar Kolev. Thank you for the extraordinary work that you do, Visar. And we also have interpretation in English in channel 2. Yes, at the same time, I would like to ask everyone to respect everyone's time today when having interventions during Q&A. And so every speaker should have due consideration to every person, and obviously we respect everyone's opinions and views. At the same time, I would also like to let you know that for the conclusion part, MEP Romeo France is not able to attend, unfortunately, because he is going to be in the EMPL, in the Employment Committee, to discuss a very important report or resolution on Roma social inclusion. And so therefore, I was asked to do the short conclusions at the very end. Having said that, I would like to proceed with our session. As Damaris has already announced it, our panel is going to discuss the challenges in preventing, combating, and sanctioning segregation in education at national and European level. And I would also start, or I'll connect this with the objective of the whole event today, which is really to facilitate discussions both on the challenges in preventing and eliminating and sanctioning segregation in education, but also to try and identify steps both at European level and national level in basically tackling, having a concrete, tangible impact on national level towards achieving zero segregation in education. And if I may, just another rule, if I can ask you to put your phones either on silent or switch them off, just so that we can have a proper conversation. Thank you so much. The first panel of this event will focus more specifically on country examples when it comes to the challenges and structural obstacles in effectively addressing segregation in education at national level. As such, the panel would try to introduce also results of important monitoring work on segregation that has been done in Romania by the CADO Association, and you will hear from the director of CADO more about this work. At the same time, we'll try to also present different examples in Bulgaria from Dejan Kolev, and I'll present him later on, and also on my right from Spain, from Carolina Fernandez, in addressing segregation in education and promoting inclusive education. And so for us, it's very important to have all of you stakeholders today to discuss this topic. Why? Because segregation in education in Romani children, unfortunately, it's very pervasive in various countries of the European Union. And different institutions, whether it was the Fundamental Rights Agency, whether there was the network of legal experts of the EU, have actually looked at the situation and have identified that segregation in education is pervasive across Europe. And I'll give you just some examples to see how deep segregation is. And it's even in countries that we wouldn't expect, such as Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czechia, Cyprus, Finland, Greece, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, the North Macedonia outside the EU, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Serbia, again outside the EU, because we also have here participants from the Western Balkans, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom as well. And school segregation, we know already that can take different forms and shape, and can be loosely divided, if you want, in like three categories. Attendance by disproportionate numbers of Roma children in so-called special schools for children with intellectual disabilities, segregated classes or sections for Roma pupils within mixed schools, and the prevalence of ghetto schools. At the same time, in many member states, including the Belgium that I mentioned before, Croatia, Cyprus, Finland, Lithuania, Montenegro, Portugal, and Turkey. As far as Turkey, it's important to also mention Turkey and United Kingdom. School absenteeism and disproportionately high dropout rates are really serious concerns among Roma, Sinti, and traveler communities. We already know, and we are so happy to also have the representatives of the Council of Europe here today with us. We know that, for instance, the European Court of Human Rights has delivered a landmark decision called DH and others versus the Czech Republic, finding that placement of Roma children in special classes as schools adapted for children with intellectual disabilities based on cultural biased tests amounted to discrimination on grounds of ethnic origin in violation of the Convention on Human Rights. At the same time, we know that at the level of the European Union, the Racial Equality Directive sets out the obligation for all the member states to combat discrimination and prevent, in particular, discrimination both based on the grounds of racial or ethnic origin, notably in social protection, education, and access to supplies and goods and services, including in housing. And so already it's been established under the EU law that segregation is discriminatory, since it implies either a less favorable treatment or an unjustified particular disadvantage, which are prohibited by this directive. And I would end this introduction by saying that at the level of the European Commission, the Commission has launched infringement proceedings against 3 EU member states, the Czech Republic in 2014, Slovakia in 2015, and Hungary in 2016 for failure to correctly implement the Racial Equality Directive due to different situations of systemic discrimination and segregation of Roma children in education. And not ultimately under the EU Roma framework as well, we have seen that the Commission has proposed a concrete target on segregation. There is a target that speaks of eliminating segregation by 50%. Obviously, it's a debatable target from various perspectives, and it's up for discussion. And also, I would like to salute already the representative from Fundamental Rights Agency here, who has worked so hardly to come up with a portfolio of indicators, including in the area of education and segregation, and you will hear later about it. So I will start now, without any other delay, to give the floor to our 4 panelists. We have added to the list of panelists also a representative from the Romanian government, Marian Daragiu, who is the state secretary in the Ministry of Education. And I think it's a great opportunity to also have a feedback from a government representative in today's panel. I will start with the first presentation, which is going to be done by Cerasela Bănică, who is the director of Center for Advocacy and Human Rights, or CADO for short, who is going to launch, at this event we are going to launch, so she will present the findings of the monitoring report that has been done in 804 schools across Romania. And I would also like to salute the colleagues and her team that is present here today, and to thank them very much for the important work that they have been doing at national level. We will start with a short video, if I can ask you to play, and then with the intervention. Thank you.
Pirita este o comunitate de romi din Baia Mare, segregată rezidențial și marginalizată social. În Pirita trăiesc aproximativ 300 de persoane, din care aproape jumătate sunt copii. Familiile din Pirita trăiesc în locuințe improvizate, direct pe pământ, construite din lemn sau cartoane pe care oamenii le găsesc pe rampa de gunoi a orașului, fără acces la utilități. 98% dintre adulți nu au deloc educație. Viața în Pirita înseamnă de cele mai multe ori nesiguranță, foame, noroi, șobolani, violență domestică și mai presus de orice, lipsă totală de viitor. Din toate aceste motive, să fii copil în Pirita înseamnă să nu prea ai copilărie. Cea mai importantă șansă pentru acești copii ar trebui să fie participarea la educație, însă lucrurile nu stau deloc simplu. Până în 2016, copiii din Pirita nu au avut deloc acces la educație. Abia după implicarea mai multor ONG-uri și multă presiune asupra autorităților locale, azi merg 85 de copii la grădiniță și școală. 57 de copii din aceștia sunt segregați. Copiii din Pirita nu pot să-și aleagă școala la care vor să meargă, pentru că părinții lor nu au o adresă în buletin, iar asta face ca ei să fie repartizați aleatoriu abia în etapa a 3-a de înscriere, când cel mai probabil vor fi puși alături de alți copii romi sau se va forma o nouă clasă segregată. Sărăcia, condițiile inumane de trai, segregarea școlară fac ca acești copii să aibă un decalaj de dezvoltare de cel puțin 2 ani față de alți copii de vârsta lor și în privința achizițiilor școlare. Segregarea școlară conduce la eșec școlar, la adâncirea problemelor de comportament, la o stimă de sine foarte scăzută și, în final, la abandon școlar.
Cerasela will have a PowerPoint presentation, so if we can have it also. You have the floor, Cerasela.
Thank you very much. I started my presentation with this video message because always when we are talking about present numbers, we forget sometimes that behind the numbers are children, are people, are humans. And we should never forget for what we are doing, for why we are requiring equal access to education, and which is our purpose of all of us here. So already Isabella started to present about the monitoring that in Romania was launched last year. And in fact, this monitoring is not our first initiative. Our first monitoring experience was done in 2015-2016, when the project, which for us it becomes like a continuation, is called A School for All Children. We start to develop a methodology for monitoring segregation. Why? Because in 2015, the Ministry of Education still didn't have a tool how to collect data, how to monitor this phenomenon. And we tested in 256 schools. The results of that day show very clearly that the tool is very necessary and can be efficiently measure the level of segregation on the ethnicity criterion. In 2016, the Ministry of Education undertakes this methodology. It modifies and it extends the indicators that at that time we developed only for the ethnicity on other additional criteria like disability, social economic status, school performance, and residential status. In 2019, the Ministry of Education adopts the methodology after many changes, political changes, but unfortunately, neither today this methodology is not applied, so it's not used. Next slide, please. So, then we decided again that in this situation of lack of evidence, the civil society should step up. And we continued the project starting in 2015, but with a new dynamic, which was, at the moment when we submitted this project in 2019, we are still hoping that in 2020 the Ministry of Education will initiate the monitoring, because this was were the promises. However, we identified the risk at that moment that this is possible to not take place. So, in 2020, we are focusing on two pillars. One is to monitor the level of preparation of the implementation of the methodology. And the second pillar is to identify which is the current dimension of the segregation in education. And we are doing another thing. We are focusing on all the criteria, not only ethnicity, because in few words, we just took the methodology of Ministry of Education and applied as we are the Ministry of Education. So we took their role. One, to test if the schools and other educational institutions are prepared, and the other one to see if the methodology is working to measure it. But we added two additional criteria: lack of attendance of online classes, because we are in the middle of pandemic context. And from the information which we had from the field, we saw that, unfortunately, the most affected communities, children or students' communities, are the Roma, or the most vulnerable students. And the additional criterion which we came on, which is related to school performance and children in need of remedial education. Why? Because the Ministry of Education is using as indicator to measure the segregation in education the repetition of the school year by the student. Which for us, it's a very long period to decide if the student, the school performance, but the student, while the remedial education need, it's identified from the beginning when the child is tested or entered in the school. Next slide, please. So this is the map of our monitoring in Romania. We focus on 11 counties from 42. It's almost a quarter of the Romanian counties, administrative units. And we focus, next slide please, we focus on 1,387 schools, which means all the schools from the primary and lower secondary education. So we didn't sampling, we didn't select, we took all the schools, as I said before, we took the role as being the Ministry of Education. And from the 1,387, wow, it's not clearly so dark. Okay, 42, they didn't answer. 42%, they didn't answer or didn't provide complete data. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. And as I said before, because as my presentation is short, I have less than 10 minutes now, I decided to show you a lot of data. So I will not talk so much about explaining everything. You can ask me later. The preparation of the application of the methodology of the Ministry of Education is focused on three secondary pillars. One, we wanted to see how the school can identify the data and then report. And the results were quite negative. 54% of them, they didn't receive any indication how this data should be collected. 90%, they think there is no negative repercussion if they don't participate in the monitoring of segregation. So they think that this is based on their will and not an obligation. 56%, they do not have a specific internal procedure how to monitor segregation. It's mainly based how to collect the data. And 33%, they don't have an inside personnel or expert who is specially assigned to collect the data, to send the data, centralized, etc. And you know what is interesting, this, even if it's a small percentage, because the schools are providing almost early, even more often, data in a dedicated educational system. And if they don't have this, it means neither the current data, they have questions regarding the accuracy. Next slide. The secondary pillars is that we wanted to see if they have the capacity in the schools to monitor. And why we identify is that they do not have a designated tool to collect the data, more than 60%. That means they don't have a questionnaire or something like this. 61%, they don't know how to report the data. 86%, they don't have an agreement with the parents to collect the personal data, which is a very important matter from the perspective of the protection of personal data. 70%, they never collect the data regarding segregation. That means even if the current order, which is from 2016, is not applied, from 2007, since the first order on segregation was adopted, they never collected data on segregation. Almost 90%, they never participated in a training or information session regarding monitoring segregation, and almost 67%, they don't know about the indicators to monitor segregation. And the last pillar is that 60% of them, they don't have trained personnel data protection, and 63%, they don't have a procedure regarding the personal data protection. And what is important is because already they are collecting personal data, they already should have this kind of procedure. Next slide, please. And now I'm going on, I think, what almost everyone wants to know, but I apologize. I didn't know that the colors on the big screen cannot be and the numbers cannot see, so no problem, I will read it. Yes, I have good eyes and good ears. Okay, so among the old five criterion, the highest is, again, ethnicity. So we measure the dimension of segregation on all the types of segregation, residential segregation, buildings, per class and the last seats in the class. However, what I will present today, it's only on buildings and classrooms. On buildings, it's 27.5% on ethnicity. On classroom, it's 66.5%. On disability, it's per buildings only 1%. On classroom, it's 8%. But I will explain why. Because most of disabled children are not studying in the mainstream schools. They study in the special schools. We apply this methodology only to the mainstream schools. Then, on parents' educational level, maximum 8th grade. On buildings, 20%. On classroom, 44%. On beneficiaries as scholarship, social scholarship, which is all of this what I'm saying now, they are indicators to measure segregation, approved by the Ministry of Education, is on classrooms, 28%, on buildings, 9%. On school performance, which is repetition of the school year, is 18%. This shows us that the next data, why it was important to add it. On the new criterion which we just proposed, which is lack of participation of the minimum 80% of the online schools, is 31%, which is higher than repetition. And the one on the need of remedial education is 43%. That shows very clearly that the new indicators which you are proposing, in fact, are measuring much earlier the segregation than the repetition. Next slide, please. And this is the map of the segregated schools. This can be accessed online. It can be accessed on our website, which is www.cado.org.ro, but I will put it at the end. And here you can access this. You can enter on each school and identify the type of segregation based on the colors. You will see at one point it's a rainbow. I apologize for LGBT, I know it's their colors, but they use the rainbow for this time to show intersectional segregation. Next slide, please. And I'm coming to the end. Here, it shows that the biggest problem, because we talk about Roma, is that most of the schools, they didn't provide data on the Roma ethnicity. And what we did, we also identify all the rural localities which they have minimum population, which is 2% according to the Romanian census. And then we try to identify if the schools from that localities, they declare the data on the Roma ethnicity. And we identify that almost 39% of them, they didn't provide this data. Next slide. And from the almost 68% who provide the data, is still a problem of 32 because they provided data lower than the threshold mentioned in the census. So again, we have an issue regarding the Romanicity. The next slide, and the last one. This is about the intersectionality of the segregation. From the 378 schools, which they have minimum one education cycle, the minimum 2 classrooms, it shows that 47% of the schools, they have minimum 2 forms of segregation. And the one who are, let's say, the highest one, it's always Roma ethnicity connected with, in connection with the social economic status. I finished my data. Thank you very much for your attention. I just want to say, and at one point someone asked me, do you have recommendation at this point regarding the Romanian government? And I say, I only have one. And please forgive my correct...
Lack of correctness?
No, my direct speech. I think the Ministry of Education in Romania should stop delaying the process of collecting data, but what is important, they should start already to desegregate the schools, because there are generations of children which are sacrificed in the name of lack of political will and lack of political action. And that means higher dropout, higher rate of literacy, and what is more important is that we, Romanians, will be 10 times more poor in the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, I'll be ready to answer to them in the session regarding questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rasra. The one question that I have in my mind, and you can already answer when we open the floor, is when we can have all of this important information available, both in Romanian and English, and where we can find it.
The report will be ready. Unfortunately, we are still working on investigation. We didn't know that would take so much time, but we want to provide as better data as possible. So it'll be on 25th May on our website in Romanian and English. We give the website, but I will share with all of you my business card. Don't worry, I'll not let anyone to live without my business card. And already we have the list of all the important and all the European institutions and even email address. And personally, I will have the pleasure to send to all of you the final report. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think it's amazing to finally have the information we all assumed that the situation was going to be in Romania. So finally, we have the proof that segregation is live and kicking and that it affects so many children. I have to now move on to the next speaker, Mrs. Carolina Fernandez. She is the Deputy Executive Director of Advocacy within the Fundación Secretariado Gitano, so many know it as FSG. One of the partners in organizing this event, and she is going to speak about school segregation of Roma pupils in Spain. Carolina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations to the organizers. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Yes? No. Okay, school segregation of Roma children in Spain. You know that, Fundación Secretariado Gitano has been working for 40 years. This year is our 40th anniversary, promoting the equal opportunities of the Roma population. Education has always been a key pillar of our work, and we focus our work mainly on two priorities. One, school dropout, and the second, school segregation. I say this because we understand that school segregation is not an isolated issue, but it's closely linked to other factors that keep Roma children in an educational disadvantage situation. Let me start, before I start my presentation, this is the poster of one of our awareness-raising campaigns. It was launched in 2018. And I will finish my presentation with the video of this awareness-raising campaign. So, we can say that in Spain, the school segregation is a result of, first, residential patterns. Obviously, there is a high concentration of Roma families living in certain areas, mainly urban areas in the case of Spain. But the school segregation is not only a result of these residential partners. There are apparently neutral measures that lead Roma children to certain schools and contribute to this concentration in certain schools. So the result of that is a segregation which is not intended, but as a result of that, there are not enough corrective measures for these patterns. Yes, next slide. There are three elements that I want to present to understand the educational system. The first one is that the education competencies are placed at regions. You know that Spain is a very decentralized country, and the regions have these competencies, which means in practice that there are a lot of regional disparities in the application of legal provision and policy measures. There are three kinds of schools, mainstream schools, that have some differences in the admission criteria. Totally or partially funded by public resources and private ones. There are, for those schools, publicly financed are the same admission criteria, but the difference is that for those who are partially financed by public resources may indirectly introduce some barriers that in practice exclude certain families, such as the Roma families, or kindly invite Roma families to enroll their kids in other schools, mainly those totally funded by public resources, which are where the highest rates of concentration of Roma family are. And the third one is that there has been a strong discussion, very ideological, about the school choice principle and the introduction of corrective measures, as if it would be in conflict to choose one or another. Next slide, please. So school segregation is a very complex issue and requires a very complex response. What we understand we need to do to tackle school segregation, and what we from Fundación Secretariado Gitano, how we work to advocate for eradicating the school segregation, is to have a legal and policy framework, an adequate legal and policy framework, to have enough financial resources and orientated to specifically combat school segregation, to have analysis and data, and to work on awareness raising. We start by the legal framework. So in Spain now we have new legislation. We have a new educational law which was approved in 2020, LOMLOE, which indeed is a step forward towards a more equal, inclusive, and quality educational system, recognizes for the first time school segregation. School segregation has never been an issue at the political agenda. This new law recognizes the fact of the school segregation, which are the challenges that there is a lack of concrete measures to prevent, combat, and reverse this segregation. There is a need for further development. Further development is required because there is not these concrete measures. And which means also that this part of the application at the end and in practice will be again inter-regions. And then we have again an unequal application of the legal provisions. And on the second hand, we have the anti-discrimination legislation. Fortunately, we are in the process of having a comprehensive equal treatment and anti-discrimination law, which is now under parliamentary process. It's finishing, and fortunately this year will be approved. This is very good news. School segregation is recognized as a form of discrimination, indeed, in a proactive approach. So what the law says at this stage, because it is still under parliamentary process, but at this stage, as far as we know, the school segregation is recognized and calls public administrations to take measures in case of school segregation through direct or indirect mechanisms. So this is very good news. The challenge is that there are no sanctions foreseen. This has a, let's say, proactive approach. As regards the policy framework, we have been strongly advocating for a plan, because we have this legal framework, but we need more operational steps. This plan for inclusive education is already intended by the government, so there is a political commitment. The intention of the objective is to develop this legal framework, provide guidelines to regions on how to in the end of a more inclusive education, establish objectives, goals, timetable, budget, and so on. Indeed, it is already committed and it is already budgeted for this year. So this is a firm commitment. The challenge is still pending, so it's not yet approved. And on the other side, we do not know to what extent school segregation, the role of the school segregation. So the plan is intended to promote inclusive education, but we do not know if school segregation will be a priority of this plan. Hopefully, it will be. Next slide, please. Financial resources. We have, as I said before, there is budget, national, regional resources. We have next generation funds. We have ESF plus funds. Child guarantee, we do not yet know, but as far as we know, the Spanish government has submitted the national plan for the child guarantee, and school segregation is within this draft. We hope that at the end it covers all the objectives, indicators, and so on, and has also resources to invest. Which is the challenge? We have a huge, really huge investment on education, inclusive, equal, and quality education, but not specifically addressed with objectives and indicators to prevent, combat, and reverse school segregations. So most probably all this investment in education will contribute to prevent, combat, and reverse school segregation, but there is not this focus on school segregation, and there is no, until now, this indicator, which we understand that are essential for put in practice. Next slide. Analysis and data. This is essential especially for public policy design. There is a big challenge, so there is a lack of analysis and data, especially of Roma school segregation. There have been some analysis and data about other kinds of school segregation, especially based on the socioeconomic situation, taking into account income of the families. But there is a lack of information about Roma school segregation. Again, in this context of a step forward in this sense of more inclusive educational system, on behalf of the Ministry of Education, we have been, during the last year, we have been making a pilot study on school segregation, specifically on Roma children. So we have now the preliminary results, not yet published. This is a sample, also, as you mentioned in Romania, this is a questionnaire to schools. We have the information of 183 schools, but I want to say that this is not a mapping of segregated schools. What we have done in this pilot study is the analysis of factors that intervene on segregation processes specifically for Roma children, and analysis of the impact on the academic results, which is at least a first step in this analysis and data information. We are partners also of the European No Segregation Project, financed by the European Commission, which has already helped us to get more information and try to advocate with public bodies on school segregation. And finally, the awareness, because this is a main challenge, at least in our country. There is a lack of visibility, there is a lack of awareness about school segregation, all kinds of school segregation. This is like a normal, it is considered as a normal process, which is not. So there is this lack of awareness about the reality, and especially about the impact, the negative impact of school segregation on children. How we tackle this lack of awareness? From one side, we build strategic alliances. In the year 2019, we promoted a big alliance on school segregation, working in a broader concept of school segregation, not only for Roma, which we understand this is a very important issue. We established this alliance with two big organizations in Spain, Save the Children and the Spanish Committee of Representatives of Persons with Disabilities. So we joined forces, and this has been very relevant for us because with these different profiles, socioeconomic disadvantage, national origin, children with disabilities, and ethnic origin, we have built an alliance that has allowed us to have more visibility, much more power to influence and to advocate on policy powers. And even if the dynamics of the school segregation of Roma children or children with disabilities and so on, we join forces, we try to have common demands and more visibility. And on the second hand, we have this awareness campaign. We have different actions, but this one was specifically focused on segregation. Before I end, I would like to show you this the video of this awareness campaign that shows an aspect of the school segregation of Roma children. So please.
¿No quiere ir a la escuela? No, no, no.
Hola, ¿querían conocer el centro? Verán, este es un centro que tiene muy buena reputación y entonces tendríamos que hacer un estudio para valorar si ella podría encajar bien, ¿ok? Sí. Hola Miriam, un segundito, ¿vale? Tenemos talleres de escritura y todo esto en bilingüe, ¿eh? Que no sé si eso sería... Estas son las aulas. Como ven, están perfectamente equipadas. En ellas tenemos solo chicos y chicas normales, digamos. Habría que valorar si ella podría encajar. Si tienen pensado seguir mirando, pues se me ocurre que podrían visitar un centro que hay justo aquí enfrente, que igual se acerca más a las necesidades que están buscando.
Hola, buenos días. Chicas, no corráis. Enseguida va a hacer amigos. La mayoría son de vuestro entorno. Bueno, pues este es la aula de informática. El nivel que damos aquí es muy básico, con lo cual, para lo que ellos necesitan, tampoco es necesario algo más moderno. Porque al final lo normal es que dejen los estudios para hacer otras cosas, ¿no? Gracias por haber venido. Y bueno, qué bonita. ¿Te gusta tu nuevo cole?
No, 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 no. Porque quiero las mismas oportunidades. Porque no quiero que me traten diferente. Porque no quiero que me discriminen. Porque no soy un alumno de segunda. Porque quiero tener amigos gitanos y payos. Porque no quiero una escuela aparte. No quiero ir a la escuela segregada.
En todas las ciudades españolas hay colegios segregados. Agrupar a niñas y niños gitanos en clases o centros separados del resto perpetúa la discriminación y la desigualdad.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, thank you so much, Carolina, for this excellent presentation and also for this very moving video. And I have to say that your intervention has very well summarized the key elements of what we are discussing in this panel when it comes to the challenges that we are facing. At the level of the legal framework, many of the countries do not have a definition of segregation within the anti-discrimination legislation. So it's amazing to see that Spain is making steps in that way, that at policy level, again, there might be some progress, so hopefully keep us informed. The financial part, it's an important part that we need to consider. The data, and again, it's so important to see that actually the government has commissioned a civil society organization to do the report for them. I think that that's, again, an amazing step, and also the awareness part. And so thank you so much, and I'll just move now to the next speaker, who is Dejan Kolev. Dejan is, on my left, is the director of the Amalipe organization in Bulgaria, and he's going to also follow up on everything that has been said through his intervention on segregation maps and some models for overcoming school segregation in Bulgaria, because they have worked on this subject for so many years and they have amazing results as well. So Dejan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Isabella. My name is Dejan Kolev. I'm chairman of Amalipe. Our organization works in the field of education 20 years. This year we have 20 years from our establishment. And in the field of education, we work now with almost 300 schools all over Bulgaria. We work for three main priorities. One is reducing the dropout rate in early school living, because it is important all Roma children to finish not only primary, but also secondary education. Second one is desegregation, because it is important Roma children to be not only to be in school, but to be in ethnically mixed school, to be in school with good quality that provide for them good chances for life. And third, also for us very important, is introducing intercultural education in order to keep the ethnic identity of Roma children and to form tolerance among all the children, because it is important our children not only to finish and to have diploma, to be educated, but also to preserve their ethnic identity. Now I will present experience from in Bulgaria of no segregation project. Thank you, Carolina, that you mentioned it. We implemented it together with Fundación Secretariado Gitano in Spain. In Bulgaria, we during the first year, we prepared school segregation maps. We did a survey that covered all districts, all areas of Bulgaria, and almost all schools and kindergartens. So only few schools were not included in the survey. It is based on the information about the educational status and the employment of families that is collected by Ministry of Education and Science. So, Ministry of Education collects information. It is not ethnic information. It is about the educational status of parents in all the schools and kindergartens. And it is obligatory for them to provide this information. So only few of them didn't provide the information. After this, Ministry of Education provided this information to us, and we proceeded the information within the project. I stress again, the information is not ethnic one. It is about the educational status of the children, of the parents, but the schools with concentration, the Ministry of Education define as schools with concentration of vulnerable students, schools where more than 20% of the parents have lower than secondary education. And we did, after this, we did expert interviews and conversations with principals and teachers, and we found that in almost all of the cases, schools with concentration of vulnerable groups coincide with schools with concentration of Roma children or Turkish children. Turks are the other big minority in Bulgaria that has a little bit higher educational status, but still is vulnerable. Next slide, please. Yeah. As I mentioned, the information is provided about the educational status of the parents, and the schools with more than 20% parents without secondary education are considered as schools with vulnerable students. They are divided into 5 categories. The first 2 categories we could define as the ethnic composition in these 2 schools as ethnically mixed in most of the cases, but they're on the menace of desegregation because there is the process of so-called white flight. When Roma children exceed 20%, Bulgarian parents start to remove their children from the school, and in 3, 4, 5 years, these schools are becoming Roma schools, although they are situated in Bulgarian neighborhoods. So the first 2 categories are schools in a menace of segregation or in process of secondary segregation. The other 3 categories are fully segregated schools. Next slide, please. 3 basic theoretical assumptions. First, regarding Roma children, educational and ethnic segregation coincide in almost all of the cases. Second, we define as segregated schools and kindergartens, schools and kindergartens that are with concentration of vulnerable groups and that are situated in settlements where we can find another schools and kindergartens where the educational status of parents is completely different. So we have in Bulgaria around 1/3 of the schools are situated in rural areas. The majority of them are visited predominantly by Roma and by Turkish children, just because Bulgarian population is urbanized. And in these villages, Bulgarians are only very old people. We don't consider these rural schools, these village schools, as segregated, and there are a lot of other models that could be applied for raising the quality in these schools. But at the same time, we have a lot of segregated schools in the towns and cities where you can find a lot of schools. So you can find very often in proximity of half a kilometer schools with Roma children and another school with only Bulgarian children. Next slide, please. You can find here a table of the schools and the vet gymnasiums that are professional gymnasiums and how many of them are with concentration of vulnerable students and how many of them we can define as segregated. So you can see that almost half of the schools in Bulgaria are with concentration of vulnerable students. Out of them, you can find that we have a big number of village schools, but at the same time, we can find 185 city or town schools that we can define as segregated, because in this place you can find many other schools. 63 schools are in process of segregation and 120 are completely or almost fully segregated schools. Regarding the vet gymnasiums, the professional schools, the situation is a little bit better because not half of them, 1/3 of them are with concentration of vulnerable students. Data 150 professional schools. Out of them, 73 are in process of segregation and 77 are segregated professional schools. Just a small remark, 20 years ago when we started working in education, the percentage of Roma who continued to study in secondary education was very, very low. And from one side, now we are happy that almost all of our boys and girls, very important also girls, are continuing to study in secondary schools, 8 to 12th grade. The bad side of the process is that the majority of them study in professional schools that are becoming more and more segregated. Next slide, please. So, possibilities for desegregation process. Thank you. You can see, no, I am okay, thank you. Thank you. So, desegregation in primary education is possible in 85 cities. 25 district cities, it's almost all of the district cities in Bulgaria. Of course, the capital of Sofia and 60 other towns. You can see in these cities there are more than 700 other schools, more than 700 schools. Out of them, 185 are schools with concentration of vulnerable students. Regarding the secondary education, here we calculated not only the professional schools, but also other secondary schools. Segregation is possible in 84 settlements, 23 district cities, and 61 other towns. Next slide, please. During this school year that is still not finishing, we pilot several desegregation models. Together with our colleagues from FSG, we have prepared draft models for desegregation. We apply the following models in Bulgaria. Preventing secondary segregation, because this is a huge problem. Now, more and more ethnically mixed schools are becoming secondary segregation because of the white flight and because the municipal authorities and Ministry of Education is not stopping this process. Another model is avoiding the existing school segregation. Just to mention, I guess all of you know, but in Bulgaria there are big Roma neighborhoods. For example, in Stulipino neighborhood, we have 40 or 50,000 people, this like separate city. Of course, in these neighborhoods, we have schools that are segregated schools. And we prepared also a model for avoiding the existing school segregation, what to proceed with this very big school. Some of them have more than 1,000 students. And also we apply model for desegregation in the rural areas. We mentioned that we don't consider the village schools as segregated in the pure sense of this word, but for sure we have to invest efforts in these schools to raise the quality and to make the children in this school to interact with the children from the towns and cities who are from the majority who are ethnic Bulgarians. Next slide, please. piloting desegregation models. This year, we implement comprehensive intervention at municipal, school, and community level. Because the schools are municipal owned, but the agenda is defined by Ministry of Education. And of course, the decision whether I will enroll my kid in this school or in another is a decision in the hand of the parent. We have free election choice in Bulgaria regarding the school. So we need to invest in these three directions. We use approach that engage the entire local community in the process of desegregation. That means teachers, students, parents. Encourage extracurricular activities with participation of students from schools with a concentration of vulnerable groups in the villages and schools without vulnerable groups in the cities, and empowering the local Roma communities. That's very important principle for us, through appointing school mediators, forming parental clubs, training of parents, and so on. And the next slide, please. I included here a few recommendations that are completely relevant to Bulgarian reality, but also they can be applied to the other countries. Just to mention, we achieved in the last 2-3 years, Bulgarian Ministry of Education approved special national program for supporting municipalities to implement desegregation. It is financed by a state budget. That's for first time. From next month, we achieved a special national program financed by the state budget that will pay the salaries of the school mediators. More than 900 mediators were appointed, and they did a really great job during the COVID crisis. They are doing a great job now. But there are a lot of other things that should be done. I fully agree with Carolina and all the preconditions you mentioned. I would add only one more precondition, and I will finish with it. We need political will. We have to have all the other preconditions, financial tools, and ESF operational programs. I missed to say this, that science and education, OP, is supporting the desegregation process through a huge amount, and I want to thank you to DG Employment, and I see Aaron Yote, who is here and who is supporting permanently us in the monitoring committee. This was done also from many other colleagues by DG Employment and DG Regio and DG Justice. But we have to have all the other preconditions, but without political will, we cannot achieve nothing. And this political will should be at municipal and at the national level. At municipal level, because the schools are municipal owned, and the decision whether to close one school or to not close, whether to transform or not transform, is voted in the city council. It is a decision of the municipality. And we have this paradox in Bulgaria now. I mentioned that Ministry of Education agreed with our suggestion and formed national program for supporting municipality for desegregation. Ministry of Education provides money, but municipalities should apply, and only few of them apply for this money. The money are available, but no political will in most of the municipalities. So I think together we have to work for making stronger awareness among all the people from Roma community and from the majority, and from convincing the political factors at local, at national level, and of course at the European level, where the thing I think is better in order to support desegregation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, for this very important work that you are doing and the Amalipe is doing in Bulgaria, and all the previous speakers. It's important to say that you are amongst the very few organizations that are dedicating their work to fighting segregation in education. Not many organizations can or are able to deal with such a pervasive aspect when it comes to anti-Gypsyism, unfortunately. So thank you so much for your work. I would like to also acknowledge again the colleagues from the Commission. We will have Mr. Jute who will be speaking in the next panel. I also want to acknowledge the MEP Livia Jaroka, who is sitting at the end of the chairs here. And so because we are very much delayed, again, I'll move to our last speaker this time around. It's a representative of a member state, Romania. He's the Deputy State Secretary in the Ministry of Education. And so he will have an intervention also reflecting hopefully on what it has been said by the NGO from Romania here. Thank you so much, Mr. Daragiu. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Aklemtumen. I would like firstly to kindly draw your attention to a very short movie, and then we will come back to discuss. So if you have it ready, please. This is Stelian and Danisa. They are Stelian and Danisa family with their 2 children, celebrating their Resistance Day every single day. We are today in the last day of the Romani Week event. Let me kindly thank Mr. Romeo Franz and our friend Marius Tudor, and all the other Roma and non-Roma collaborators, partners, colleagues that put together their efforts to give us the possibility to meet together those days and to remember about our people, about our neighbors, about people like Stelian and Danisa, and to discuss different topics. Today the topic is school segregation. And it's for the first time when I'm coming in front of you with a position representing the Ministry of Education as a Roma, Deputy State Secretary after 25 years of working in the civil society, doing research, doing what Cerasela Bănică, our colleague, just presented you as a work of CADO organization, and let me thank you, guys and friends, for your commitment and for your data. All those data are needed for the decision makers, and indeed, it gives us, the one that are interested in the phenomenon of segregation, food for thought, gives us the information and the numbers to be able to create, to adapt, and to act as responsible representatives and institutions which are knowing and being aware of the results, of the impact, of what it means to be and to learn into a segregated school. And segregation, as you have already seen, it is interpreted from different perspectives. I wouldn't go to all the ministerial decisions, the orders, to give you numbers and how segregation through the strategy of the Ministry of Education is set up and drawn, and how the methodology and the indicators are put it together, or referring to the recommendations that are coming from the this time from the Council of the European Union, where we are recommended how to desegregate the schools. Going back and thinking to Stelian and Denisa, I'm asking you all, what is about the Ministry of Education responsibility? What is about the Ministry of Labor responsibility? How would it be to think about the Ministry of Family? How would think about the government per ensemble? How would be about the politicians to give hands and to discuss about real things here? Desegregating a school, I don't know how we'll respond to the kids that we have seen in those pictures, and there are hundreds and thousands. Desegregation seen from the perspective of ethnic criteria, or can we talk about the residential? It is interesting where are this family from the perspective of residential? Are they in rural, urban? Who cares at the end of the day? Or shall we talk about the social and economical status of the family? Or shall we talk about the results in schools of those kids? Or how do they get in school, and how do they will be perceived by the teachers? And we've seen how the teachers reflect and report to those children coming from this area. Dejan Kolev, our colleague, mentioned something that I underlined here with green in 3 times: political will. We do need a political will. Okay, those data shows us some more precisely how phenomena affects the lives of our children in different communities. We know those data. It's nothing new under the sun, if I can say that. Of course, they are helping us again to justify and to move to actions. But in fact, we need to discuss about how we integrate our approach, fighting against discrimination, racism, segregation, and all of those are realities. We cannot hide those realities. We should not hide those realities. We are coming with those realities. We lived with them as Roma. We've been in those schools. We are, at the end of the day, the product, the result of those schools, except we are only some exceptions. And the big mass, the majority of our children are still over there. My call today to all of you is to think in an integrated manner. And I want to also to refer to Mr. Yute, which I met him into a meeting of 3 or 4 hours with the Minister of Education, with all the state secretaries in the Ministry of Education, talking about the integrated perspective of how to use the operational funds, the structural, the instruments, those financial instruments in an integrated manner, and how to put the money that are related to education together with the money that are related to employment and the money that are related to health. And I have to tell you, it's not easy. There are different hats And all those heads are somehow separately, but Stelian and Danisa, they are only one family with the multiple factors that keeps them separately by the society, and they need an action. They don't care who is actioning. They don't care who is going to help them. They just want to be helped in an integrated manner. That's why I sustain, and I lobby you, and I kindly ask you to continue, 1 minute and finish it, to continue to support our government and our specialists to work on the community integrated centers, the way to be responsive in a multiple way and in parallel to the needs of such families, and I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this intervention. We have one more change to the agenda because of time constraints. We have now Mr. Ivan Ivanov that will also have his presentation now instead of the second panel. And so you can also address him questions before he leaves, if he can still. And then we will move on to the second panel. Thank you very much. You can have my chair here. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, colleagues, for your understanding. I really apologize, but the fault is not mine. The travel agency changed my flight in the very last moment, and it's really not the most pleasant one. I will try to be quick and to have more time to discuss at least a few moments. When preparing for this session, I was thinking what to talk about, because show some slides is interesting, but maybe not the most important thing, because the topic is the challenge of segregated education and what can we do for more effective advocacy. And I think there are two elements in this, two pillars. One is, it was mentioned several times, to have the data, the evidence, and the second element is to have the human face, the stories behind the figures, because anonymized figures don't speak much, but when you relate both, it does. And Fundamental Rights Agency is in the business of data and evidence, and I hope the civil society, other actors can complement this pillar with the stories. Next slide, please. What do we do? I think we can even skip this slide because I will summarize it very quickly. What we are trying to do is support the member states and the European Commission in the area of data. So we collect data for populating the indicators which would allow monitoring progress, which hopefully will be there. And moreover, with the new EU Roma framework for equality, inclusion and participation, we have targets. And targets means indicators which are populated with data. Where do we want to be in the year 25, 26, 2030? This slide summarizes the surveys which we have implemented all across EU. These surveys, basically, as you see in the dark blue, cover most of the EU member states. We have data for most of the EU member states. They were done in different years, but still they are comparable, and they can be and will be used as a baseline for the current programming period. Next slide, please. Apart from the data itself, I think it's important to have the ownership. The ownership is not just having the data, but who is producing this. I was too quick to ask for the next slide. Just one important detail. In the last survey in 2020, 2021, we have two countries which were not covered. This is Bulgaria and Slovakia. And I think it's very important to mention this because the long-term idea or hope will be for the member states to take over the responsibility. It's not that we don't want to do this research and surveys, but it's much more important when the national governments take the responsibility and you trigger a totally different process. It's not just some agencies' phrase data. It's their data, which is much easier and hopefully faster and more efficient to be integrated into the policy process. So now let's go to the next slide very quickly, the issue of segregation. We have the objective number 4, and in a Roma equality, inclusion and participation frameworks, which calls to cut the gap in participation in early childhood education and care, but also to reduce the upper secondary completion, the gap in the upper secondary completion rate. And in the next slide, you will see the horizontal, very important issue, focus on desegregation, because we cannot have the first two without desegregating. And desegregation means, with very important target, to reduce the gap by 2030 by 1/5, actually by 20%. And here we come to the next slide, what data say. In 2016, the previous survey, we had 44% of the Roma surveyed in these countries. The children attending schools where most or all were of Roma origin, basically segregated. Unfortunately, I cannot display you the data for the last survey because we are still finalizing it, but we have the preliminary result, and they were even mentioned by some of the Commission representatives at the beginning, that they is circulating. And the message is unfortunately not very good, because we see increase in this percentage. Now more than half in 2021, more than half of Roma children are attending segregated education. Instead of moving forward, we are still moving backward, and this is an alarm for all of us and for the governments primarily. Next slide, please. I mentioned national ownership and the involvement of the national stakeholders. I will give you examples from Bulgaria, and here I can have the data because the survey in Bulgaria was completed, and this data is already available. We see Bulgaria is one of the countries which have particularly challenges in regards school segregation and respectively need to desegregate. It is one of the countries which has deteriorated. From 2016, it has 58% of the children in this age group, 16 to 15, who attend schools where most or all schoolmates are Roma origin. And in 2020, it is already 64%. But we also, with the Bulgarian colleagues, took the effort and integrated different sources of information to put this data into context in more depth and to see the relationship between residential and school segregation. And this is the next slide. It shows, when it appears, how this is performing in areas which are defined as Roma neighborhoods. We have them all. Dejan mentioned one of the biggest, Stolipinovo, but there are much more than that. Inside and outside these neighborhoods. And you see that the picture is quite gloomy. Inside the Roma neighborhoods, there's logical higher share of these people who are children who attend mostly or all Roma populated schools. But it is also important message triggering this vicious circle, which also Dejan mentioned, that once a school is perceived as a Roma school belonging to a Roma neighborhood, the chances are very slim to really effectively desegregate. Which leads us to the next question, that what can be done? Well, not only desegregate schools, but also desegregate residential conditions. And that might be one of the priorities, which to have both objectives run in parallel. Next slide, please. I think these are the concluding remarks. I don't want to sound very pessimistic. I still am hopeful that in the coming years, the governments will be able to catch up. Because the challenges are there. The issues which were highlighted are not just typical for Bulgaria. They are also similar in Slovakia, Croatia, and Romania. And as I mentioned at the beginning, of all children aged 6 to 15, more than half are still currently attending segregated education. How do we reach the target? Less than 20%? This is really a billion question to answer. I very often, allow me one personal comment, very often we hear the political will, and it is really critical. Political will is there, but I think we are missing sometimes one important element, and this is the sense of joint belonging of society. If the people, the citizens, who are the voters, have the impression that, okay, they can live, segregate themselves, fence from this Roma, which we don't have anything to do, then it's much difficult to expect the politicians to have the courage, even if they have the will, to do something. And I think we should focus more on this aspect, boosting the sense of community and joint shared belonging. One way of doing that might be the conditionalities. We had the conditionalities before, we have them now. But what about conditionalities at national level? Why, for example, a mayor or municipal council would be happy to spend money for some EU-funded infrastructural projects, but not want to have anything on desegregation? Why don't we combine and put the conditions? Yes, you can have access to EU funds, but solve your problems in parallel, which you have, and we know where are these problems. We have the data, we have the maps, we have all the characteristics and the variables which are necessary to be used. So I think closing the political will is important, but I think the most important would be to have the political will to implement conditionalities, bringing together desegregation and other regional and local development EU-funded initiatives. Thank you for your attention, and apologies for this rushed intervention.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And I really take the last sentence of what you said as the key element of what we need to focus on moving forward at national level, on being able to create these conditionalities, on funding also for municipalities. In the interest of time, I have had some discussions with the next panel moderators, so we will have 10 minutes for discussions. And I don't know if you can still take one question, and then I think you may have to leave. I have already someone that has signed up to intervene. It's Mr. Petrovic. You have the floor.
And thank you very much. I will speak in Romanes. Thank you to everybody, especially to those from the Commission who gave me some time to tell you something important to me. I want to ask you something, but after this, I don't wanna read anything, because everything what I wanted to say was confirmed to me. I would like to make a small conclusion. First of all, to represent myself, I'm engineer Ivica Petrovic, Doctor of Economic Sciences from Austria. I lived there 32 years. I was born in Yugoslavia, in Serbia. It's a small introduction. I'm a politician. I have 25 years in politics, and I have a big function in a political party in ex-Yugoslavia. It is a fact that EU does a lot, works a lot for Roma to live better and to educate themselves. In these 4 days, I saw a lot what projects are done for the Roma, and this is very nice, and it is very good presented as well. Thank you to all of you. who presented. It is a fact that these countries where Roma live in, there is a big pressure of work for Roma to live well and to educate themselves. It is a fact that there are many organizations that want to help Roma with projects and to work on Romani education, and they are fighting against anti-Gypsyism and discrimination. For the Roma, in the last 3-4 days, we saw that for the Roma are being built houses, blocks. In many schools, there are Romani assistants. There are schools in Europe where Romani language is being taught. There are many projects in Montenegro, in Bosnia, which we saw yesterday, and that Romani students are being funded in Serbia, in Spain. We also saw that Romani people have parties in Spain, in Serbia. They have political representatives in the parliaments. We have to be thankful to EU that in all the countries where Roma live. In Europe, live not only Roma. Roma live not only Europe but in all the world, and this is very important. That what I'm saying now, that Roma don't live only in Europe, but in all the world, and we are 80 million people, Roma, all over the world. But it is the fact that whatever Europe invested in Roma in the last 30 years, it is not enough. There is so many Roma without work. Roma live by the dump waste, by the containers. I saw pictures. I started crying. I'm begging you now. I don't have time to speak 3 or 5 minutes, but it is enough. Is enough. Trust me, it's enough. You will hear in the end.